Hello again, guys. Another Q&A with a change of shirt and a change in the scenery here, because there's an addition, a very small addition of my micro machines. I have autofocus turned off, but it's my micro machines Countach, which I painted myself. Yes. It's the only toy that my parents didn't took back from me when I left the house. They never told me. I got all this Technic Lego, it's all great, and then I move out of the house and they keep it for their grandchildren. But that's much better, I wouldn't use it anyway. No point in keeping the old stuff, so no hard feelings, Mom and Dad. Today I want to talk about modding. I've got quite a few questions here. Modding related stuff and physics related stuff. So let's jump right in. Eric Cross asks what I think about head movement effects graphically, because I turn them off in my videos. Well, I quite like head movements until. So when using triple screen I don't like it anymore, but on a single screen, especially as long as the head movement is physics based, that's very important. So I don't want random head shakes, because that can be quite confusing, because why is the head shaking? Is the road bumpy, or are there g-forces on the car? So that can be off-putting, and there is a little bit of fake vibration in Stock R Extreme, but not to the point where you think you're on a cobblestone road, for example, which the default R-factor bump settings, shake settings can be. But the physics related head movement, there's nothing wrong with that, and it doesn't distract me as much when using a single screen. And it actually helps a little bit judging how smooth you brake, because if you're on and off the brake you will see the view go front and back. So I quite like that. But on a triple screen I prefer just to have everything static, because it's a little weird having the view change so much. I sometimes have it on this a little bit, but it must be physics based and used in moderation. That's how I feel about it. Then Billy Pilgrim asks, how do I know how a particular car handles? That's a very good question, because I don't really. That's always a difficult thing. The main properties of the car are very important, so just the dimensions, the weight, weight distribution, track, wheelbase, just those things are very important, and usually you can find that information, and that says a lot about the handling of the car already. But other than that, you know, sometimes you know a bit about aerodynamics for a racing car, but often you don't. So it's all a matter of burping on camera and then coming up with an excuse why you don't know how a car handles. But there's a lot of interpretation in aero, suspension, tires, and that's part of the fun as well in it. So you watch videos, but they aren't really conclusive all the time. You go with the data and experience and subjectively how you think it will handle. But don't underestimate the importance of just the big stuff like the wheelbase and the weight distribution. It says a lot, and it really affects, that's 80% of the car already. Oh, I'm spitting. What's happening? It's quite late and my eyes are going red and I can't see, but that's the excuse for any dumb answers that I'm giving, which I probably will. And Guillermo Zilfa asked me, have you ever been unhappy with the end result? I'm correcting some English as I read it sometimes, of any cars you've done. I know it's kind of a dumb question, since if you're unhappy you wouldn't release it and probably you would fix it. But well, who knows? That's not a dumb question at all, actually, because you get carried, I do anyway, get carried away when creating a car, and usually when I release it I'm at least reasonably happy with it, but that the happy-o-meter goes up and down every hour when I'm testing it and creating it. Sometimes it's just you're running around in circles even when you're not doing NASCAR, so it can be difficult to find the path to take to make the next improvements. And sometimes when you're tired of doing hours and hours of testing, you're not thinking clearly anymore. But it tends to be later, like a year after initial release, I try the car again, and in you know, my initial impressions could be that why is this slip angle, why are they this size, or why is the inertia this way, or so it's mainly in hindsight. So yeah, but overall I always still enjoy driving those cars, but I probably would have done them different, and that goes for all cars that I've made. If I do them now, I would probably do them reasonably differently from back when I first did it. Doesn't mean that they will be better or more realistic necessarily. I probably picked up some new knowledge, but there's just a lot of not everything is available in data. In fact, mostly not. Most of the time, nothing is. So there is a lot of interpretation and subjectiveness, which is fun as well. So going back to that question, I possibly would do the historics mod differently, but that's a very old mod by now. I learned more about the physics engine and the tire model. So I think I would make those cars better to drive than they are, but even as they are, they're a lot of fun. But I think there's a bit more to gain there. But I drove the Corvette mod, and those slip angles and inertias, looking at them now, probably would do it differently again. So it's never ready, it's never the best, it can always be improved. Then the Sniper is back asking me why I don't, well, let me freely translate the question, why I don't take a mod and make physics for it. Well, I do that personally, like privately a little bit sometimes. Just can't help making a Group C car, for example. But you're opening a world of trouble when doing that, because often there's no permission for certain parts of the mod, or perhaps the mod is the 3D model is legit, but then the sounds are ripped from something. So it becomes a legal nightmare if you would release something, and often, basically, honestly, the quality isn't there in the 3D model or in the sounds. And if stuff is scratch made and really high quality, then I wouldn't mind supplying physics for an interesting car in R Factor. But for example, with Sim, with the NSX and the Corvette, really good 3D model, and well, in the NSX case I did the sounds, but yeah. So if it's good enough, and then I would consider it. But the next question is about the Delta Wing. I've made some videos about creating the Delta Wing, which drove at Le Mans and was kicked out by Toyota. What was it? If I would release that, I actually had a few people contact me that, hey, I'm working on this 3D model for the Delta Wing, can we use your physics? I said, yeah, sure. If it's good, it's scratch made, properly done, but I haven't heard from them yet. But if there is a good Delta Wing 3D model out there for R Factor that's legit, that you made yourself and it's high quality, I would certainly release the physics at some point, although they need work, so it won't be next week. David Crabtree asked me, hey, what do you think about power steering in simulators? Now I could read the entire question, but basically his argument is that power steering isn't modeled in most simulators. It might be in some, I'm not aware. I know it's not implemented in Game Stock Car, for example. Because as wheels get more realistic, with direct drive wheels becoming less unaffordable, and we don't have power steering modeled in the physics, wouldn't that affect like the feel and handling of the car? I don't know enough about power steering to make a proper judgment. What I do think is that power steering in most cars, there is a torque sensor in the shaft of the wheel, so it senses how hard you're turning, which we don't have in our wheels, and it's very hard to derive that from the current and the voltage. I think I doubt you know how hard it's all being pushed and turned. So if that's correct, if I'm right, that you kind of need a torque sensor to do modern power steering, then that makes it very difficult to do at all for the wheels that we have. As the helicopter flies by, we live near the hospital, and I guess some guy fell off his bicycle or something and is transported over here. Let's hope he or she is okay. So power steering in that regard is difficult, plus the majority of you won't have that direct drive super steering wheel, and with like a Logitech or most other consumer wheels, there's power steering all the time because they don't have the torque. So ideally yes, but I don't think it's the biggest issue, that we don't have power steering models, and perhaps some sims have it in a certain way, but again, I'm not enough of an expert on it, as I'm not enough of an expert on anything really, but certainly not on power steering. And then a good couple of questions from Risto Itchov, who I remember from the R-Factor, no, the Grand Prix Legends days. Ta-da! He asked me a couple of things about modding. How do you deal with tire modeling when you don't have any tire data to work with? How do you decide on things like cornering, stiffness, and then a lot more technical mumbo jumbo? Which is quite interesting, because a lot of the time you don't have tire data. And when you have tire data, as I've made a document about that some years ago, even if you have data, you probably cannot really trust it. There is such a margin on the tire test equipment and subjective interpretation of the engineers who work with the tire data. So basically all the time there's no data when it comes to the grip stuff. The data that you can use often is, for example, the vertical, the spring rate of the tire, because especially with downforce cars and in F1 where the suspension is very stiff, the movement of the tire is actually quite important, and I tend to trust the data for the radius of the tire, how that gets smaller with load and how it increases with speed and that sort of stuff. So there's certainly data that you can use, but regarding the grip levels, how do you decide on that is just years of modding, years of making cars, and that doesn't mean that what I do is correct, because, well, nobody knows what correct is, but there's some logic, and which may not be logical at all, but just after a lot of time, I have some ideas of how the sidewall height might affect the slip angles that occur, or how that might affect the cornering stiffness, and things like load sensitivity, how the grip of the tire changes with vertical download. I got some ideas how that might be related to the compound softness basically, but it's a number of theories that I have that I juggle with, and most of the time the balls fall on the floor, the tires fall on the floor, I guess. But infinite things to do, and there is no hard truth in there. Well, there probably is, but nobody knows what it is, so yeah, difficult and fun at the same time. There's never-ending possibilities. And then the most interesting thing, how do you distinguish between physics affecting the handling and the car setup affecting the handling? That's an area where I often find myself stuck, because when do you stop tweaking the tire and then you start to drive and adjust things like the ride height or the spring or anti-roll bars or the dampers in the car setup, both of which have a big effect. So the tires, yes, and the suspension setup and stuff as well. I go in circles really there, and often I think I spend too much time on the tires and on the aero and not enough time on the setup. I don't know if that's correct or not. There isn't, with this, there is no correct, there is no wrong, there is no right, but recently I've been thinking I'm not spending enough time with the setup, but then I'm pretty sure once I play more with the setup I will probably go back to the tires again. It's constant iteration up to a point where you're not even sure if your latest change is an improvement or not. So man, this is always such a challenge and difficult, and you have to not be as tired as I am right now, because when you drive and you're tired you feel a lot of different things, or you might be a bit more negative, and then if you had a good meal and you know, a good lunch, and you're very positive and you drive the same car, you will have different subjective interpretations of it. So the complexity never ends. And he also asks, and I'll summarize it a bit, from what's most important when you want to power slide a car, have control over the limit and not just spin out, as some people say you do with certain mods or sims. That's an interesting question, because over the years our hardware has become better. So I had big latency, single screen, as the neighbors are screaming or people outside are screaming, but hey, perhaps that trauma helicopter has to come back soon. Anyway, I live in the best part of town though, so what could go wrong? But as our hardware gets better, the physics can be more difficult basically, and you can still control it. So for example, when I first started, I wanted to control the 1978 F1 car power sliding out of a Montreal hairpin, which was very difficult. I had no force feedback, I had a laggy screen, no good pedals, and not as much knowledge about physics or how to drive. And that's really changed over the years, because I've got low latency screens, got better force feedback, and I still don't know how to drive, and I still don't know about physics. But at least some of these things have improved, and now with the force feedback it actually helps so much with controlling opposite lock that the tire I can slide with now can be a lot harder to drift or to slide with than the tire I had to create years ago with the worst hardware. So that's an evolving thing, and it's mainly tires, but it's also with aero, how that falls off with yaw, and just general logicalness of the suspension. I used to think it was just the tire slip curves, but there are more things involved. Not just the hardware, which is a very big part, but everything basically. Once the car becomes more neutral and isn't in big understeer, for example, all the time. You know, when a car has a lot of understeer, you sort of fight it and you want to throw it around to get rid of the understeer, and then you can overdo that. But once you know how to make a car that's more balanced, kind of neutral, then the oversteer isn't sudden, but it's sort of a gradual, it's the next small step from neutral. So, everything influences it. And then Sparrow asks, what are the odds of you making a series about setting up a car for dummies, car setup for dummies? It's not a bad idea, thank you for suggesting it, but I want to do it differently, of course, possibly worse, who knows, than is the norm with car setup guides that you read on the internet. I want to do it differently, and that means it will be difficult and complicated, and I'll confuse myself, and then it won't happen. So don't hold your breath. What satisfies you the most when creating mods? Rich32G asks me. There isn't really one thing. It's let's give you some examples. A while ago I made a Formula 3 car with a lot of data available. Aero data, all the suspension data, car setup data, bump rubber data. And it can be really satisfying to just put in all the real numbers, and then only with some variables in the tire basically remaining, create that car and drive it and have it match the real telemetry. That's very satisfying, and there's relatively little to do, although of course it's difficult to implement all the real data as accurately as possible. The aero maps, for example, are quite difficult to match, but we got within about 1% of the Dallara wind tunnel data, which apparently is reasonably trustworthy. I don't know, all data is, you should be skeptical of all data. But that can be satisfying just to create all the parts. So now in that simulator you can select the bump rubbers that you use, the end of the suspension travel, and that actually follows the real data quite well. So if in the real car you use a certain bump rubber, which will affect the ride height, because at some point the bump rubber is hit when you downforce pushes the car down, that effect will be objectively, quite a difference, objectively measurably the same in the sim as it is in the real car. So that's really satisfying. But it's also very satisfying when there is no data at all, and everything has to come from experience and knowledge, some of which flawed, but very interesting just to create a car from scratch and then have fun with going a certain direction with the aero or the tires, just based on how it might be, how you imagine it to be. So it's also very interesting doing such a thing, creating a car from scratch. I do everything in a spreadsheet, so I haven't done a lap when I've already spent hours and hours creating the car. And that first moment of driving, it can be quite interesting, because it tends to be pretty good right out of the box, because I've done this for such a long time. It's very cool to drive the first laps in your raw sort of first car, but it's also interesting with that Formula 3 car, for example. I want to match the car with telemetry, which means I have to drive like a proper racing driver. So I'm certainly challenged there to perform as a race driver and have the right braking curves and lines and consistency in my driving, which really pushes me to my limits. And that enables me to adjust the tire grip and load sensitivity and everything. so that the car that I create is actually following the real data, but it's also driven on my limit, or close to the car limit, which is not quite the same, but that's being challenged from many different ways, and not one of these is the most satisfying. They're all really interesting parts. But where are we? I'd love to know if you have any mods in progress at the moment. As I kick the camera stand. No, not really. Just of course for a game stock car. We've got the supercar coming, and a car that's based on the Australian V8 supercars, which will be quite awesome. Those are some amazingly fun and interesting cars to drive. Then a long question from Alvaro Piloto. In sim racing world, sorry about that English, I didn't write it, not that I'm good at it, but hey, there are people interested in engineering, and on the other hand there are people interested in driving. It's like a classical dichotomy, okay, I think I know what you mean, between reason and feeling, materialism and spirits, yin-yang. And this division probably also applies on modders. Unfortunately, they sometimes work in different directions, and they often disagree and even attack each other. The most radical theoreticals and parameter purists believe that a modder must be very wise about car dynamics. However, do you think a modder who can't drive can set a good handling for this car? What about the physics programmers? What happens when they don't like to drive? Don't have the will or feeling a true car on his hands? Thank you. Very interesting question, and I'm running out of time, so I have to go a bit quickly. It's very interesting because I tend to feel that it's better to be reasonably good at a lot of things rather than to be just an expert in one. Perhaps being reasonably good at making a tire model would result in a worse tire model, but one that is more geared towards being adjusted by a guy like me, and the end result might be better. And I'm not the best physics knowledge guy that there is, absolutely not. I'm not the best driver behind the wheel that there is. I don't have the best tire knowledge, what you can find, but I know a little bit about all these things. And I'm surprised how reasonably good I can sort of create that Formula 3 car, for example, without being an expert in anything and just being somewhat okay at a few aspects. So subjectively, if you ask me, that's possibly better than a guy who knows everything about tires but cannot drive, so he doesn't know what to adjust and how it should feel. So I think it's better to be sort of a generalist rather than a specialist, really. And the question is interesting: is there any possibility of you branching off and making your own titles? Well, that's just not happen. That's scary. Plus I lack all the skills you require. And then finally, Ruud Hermans asked me, you've mentioned that you've got something to do with the home simulator of Guido van der Garde. What rig is he using and what sim? R-Factor, R-Factor Pro, if it's possible for him to shoot a little video so we can see his home setup. Well, Guido sadly no longer drives in F1, of course, but yeah, he has a playseat F1, which is not ideal, but it kind of works. We've strengthened it a bit with my pedals, of course, and a sim steering wheel with a replica Sauber F1 wheel, 3D printed, which I connected up. That's pretty cool. He uses regular R-Factor with a mod that I made for him, so it's just a regular R-Factor with my physics. Those are some questions. Thank you very much again. Thanks for your time, and see you later. Bye bye.